Mark Skousen is known as America's economist, and rightfully so. He is a financial historian and best-selling author with a PhD in economics from George Washington University. He taught at Columbia Business School and is currently a presidential fellow at Chapman University. His research helped inspire the US government's adoption of gross output, GO, as a key measure of the economy, which he championed in the Wall Street Journal. Skousen has worked across government, non-profits, and the private sector, serving as a CIA analyst, the president for the Foundation for Economic Education, and a longtime editor of Forecasts and Strategies, his award-winning investment newsletter. He is also the founder and producer of Freedom Fest, the world's largest gathering of free minds in Las Vegas. And on top of all of this, he is a prolific writer. He has authored more than 25 books, including The Structure of Production, The Maxims of Wall Street, and his newest book we'll be discussing today, The Greatest American, Benjamin Franklin, the world's most versatile genius. Mark, welcome to the show.
Paul, it's nice to be here at Cato. Pretty cool.
Well, it's lovely to have you, and it's lovely to be able to talk about someone like Benjamin Franklin, who is such a character. A lot of us get the idea that we know something about him because he's everywhere in the world. Whether it's on the dollar bill or in our just regular sayings of life, Benjamin Franklin seems to pop up time and time again. And your title, it seems like it's very complimentary, The Greatest American, but you're actually referencing someone, Henry Steele Commander. And I wanted to ask you, why do you think Franklin was considered by many historians to be the apostle of modern times? Why is he considered to be the most modern of the founding fathers? And another thing is that he's aged a lot better than other founding fathers. People like John Adams and George Washington, we revere and respect them, but in some ways they're kind of older, stodgier figures. But Franklin has kind of always stayed current and always stayed modern. So why do you think he is the greatest American and the apostle of modern times?
Yeah, so in reading what historians have said about Ben Franklin, the accolades just keep coming about him being, they never say the greatest American except Henry Steele Commander. He was an historian in the 50s, and that's where I got that idea. But Ken Burns says he's the greatest American diplomat. Mm-hmm. Others say the most modern of the founders. Others say the first humorist, the founder of American capitalism. Once you start listing all of these things, you say, well, maybe he's just the greatest American. And in fact, they did a survey, and he came in fifth among all the, this is in 2006, I think, or something like that. They did a survey of the greatest American, and so he tied George Washington, and believe it or not, number one was Ronald Reagan. But I think that was the time period where Reagan had just passed away, and so they were honoring him by saying he was the greatest American. Mm-hmm. But Franklin, I came up with 22 careers that he had. So he's a jack of all trades and a master of most. Mm-hmm. And it turned out that there's something about Franklin that everybody can benefit from. I've given lots of talks on Franklin, and Republicans and Democrats, and they all like him. He's a kind of a unifier, and boy, that's something that we need in today's divisive world. Franklin has a lot of advice. So my book is 80 short chapters on Franklin and how to apply his life and his lessons of life in today for personal finance, investing, diplomacy, how to win friends and influence people, healthy living, sex. We cover pretty much every part of his life and how to apply it to today's hot issues.
Well, I want to hold the book up because you said 80 chapters. It mm-hmm. gave the impression that it would be some massive tome.
Well, it's over 300 pages, but I would consider short reading. Yeah,
it's a long book at 380 pages, but it's a book that's respectful of your time because, as you've said, you've got a pretty extensive breakdown of the chapters and a pretty extensive index as well. So, well, normally we talk about the founding fathers, we talk about them as great minds, and we focus very specifically on politics, always their political wisdom. Franklin kind of bucks the trend entirely. He's not just a political thinker, he's an economic thinker, he's a philosopher, he's kind of a self-help guru, he's a financial advisor, he's kind of a tastemaker in society. Why was he so different from the rest of the founder? There's something unique about him that he wasn't just interested in politics or one field, he was interested in everything.
Yeah, that's why I had that subtitle, The World's Most Versatile Geniuses. It's actually come from Michael Hart, who wrote the 100 most influential people in the world. And Franklin is on there for the world's most versatile genius. And I came up with 22 careers. There may be more that he had as an inventor, a scientist, a printer, a businessman. He was not a lawyer, and a lot of the founders were lawyers. But he certainly got into the legal field because he was a diplomat, and he dealt with legal documents, including the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Treaty of Paris, and other such legal documents. And as a businessman, you have to do that in that respect. But he seemed to, and he was much more of a world traveler. He lived a whole generation older. He was a generation older than all the other founders. So diverse. He seemed to be very diverse, and he really was a genius because he was really good at every area that he got involved in. So I think his application to today's world is really valuable, and that's one of the reasons I wrote the book.
And he was never bad at any of his particular careers. It does seem like he was pretty much bang on the money on all of them. As a writer, he was excellent. As a printer, he was excellent. He was an amazing diplomat. Is there ever anything he faltered on that he just didn't really hit the mark he wanted to?
Well, some historians say he was not a very good mathematician, although I have a chapter because he did do the magic squares, and he had at one point a magic square of 64 rows, and each number, of course, has to add up to another to the same number. So that wouldn't be easy. So I don't think he was a bad mathematician, but at one point he confessed that he was. But he was really diligent. Diligence is a really strong word that when he wanted to focus on something, he did. So to become a good writer, he often looked at who was a good writer, and he would memorize and write their entire sentence, their entire speech, their entire article that they wrote. And if you look at Franklin's writing style, it really was quite beautiful and elegant.
One of the earliest writings of Benjamin Franklin is under the pseudonym Silence Dogood, where he actually quotes Cato's letters, the namesake of the Cato Institute, on freedom of speech. And so what were some of the early influences that got him thinking about all these different topics, whether it was politics, economics, science, philosophy? Who were some of the early influences on his life that set him on this path? Or was he just a self-guided man?
Well, a newspaper man, a reporter, has to know a little bit about everything, and that was Benjamin Franklin's approach. He worked for his older brother James. He was an apprentice for the publication, a publication in Boston, and so you really cover everything when you cover a newspaper. And he was particularly attracted to the editorial page, and Silence Dogood is his nom de plume that he used specifically because he didn't want his older brother to know who it was. So he kept that a secret. James finally found out who it was and was really upset and angered with his method. But James got into trouble a few times. He landed in jail, and during that time, Benjamin took over and did a better job. James didn't like that. So finally, they had an altercation, and Ben Franklin left as a teenager, and he ended up in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, and became a really excellent printer, superior than anyone else through his various apprenticeships, and was so good at it that he was able to retire at the age of 42, and that's when he started his experiments in science, his inventions, and that's when he got involved with civic affairs and started establishing improving the city of Philadelphia, raising money for various causes.
I want to focus in on that retiring at 42, because today that is an extremely impressive thing to do. To retire at 42 would be fantastic, but to do it in the 18th century is a gargantuan challenge. And unlike many of the founders, he didn't have generational wealth behind him. Franklin was like a self-made man. Everything he made with his own two hands. He wasn't given some status or political position or inheritance. And so his success, it truly was his own, and it truly was something quite meteoric to retire so early. What are some of the things we can learn from Franklin's work ethic there? Because obviously he was doing something right if he can thrive so well in this field.
So in his book, The Way to Wealth, he focused on three grand principles: industry, thrift, and prudence. So he worked hard, he worked overtime. He made sure the public noticed that he was pushing the wheelbarrow for his printing office in the middle of the evening while everyone else was enjoying themselves. Thrifty, he was always living within his means. He was very careful. He was very cost conscious, which is a sign of most successful entrepreneurs. But prudence is one of the most difficult things to learn, and prudence is something that you learn gradually. He talks about his hard-to-govern passions, and he had an illegitimate child and engaged in irresponsible behavior from time to time. But he learned from that, and he said, I've got to overcome that. So in the autobiography, he has this famous section where he lists 12 virtues, and modesty and silence and frugality. There's a lot of these terms. They're all self-absorbing, by the way. Charity doesn't even show up in the list, which is kind of interesting. And he, and at the end, he showed it to a friend, and he said, "Well, you're missing one of the virtues, and that is." You're known as a very vain person. Did you know that, Mr. Franklin? He wasn't a Dr. Franklin at that point. And so Franklin listened, and he added a 13th virtue of humility to follow Jesus and Socrates.
So he writes these two books in The Way to Wealth and Advice to Young Tradesmen.
It's not really a book.
Pamphlet.
These are little pamphlets or articles that he wrote and stuff like that.
But these are probably like some of the earliest examples of what we would call today like self-help literature. The idea that you can like pull your stuff up by the bootstraps, you can do better for yourselves. Is Franklin kind of an original thinker in this field? It seems like there's not many people before Franklin that we can point to having this idea of self-help and making your own situation better, not waiting for other people to come along, but taking it into your own hands. Is Franklin the first self-help author, or is he just among the first?
No, I think he's the first. And the autobiography had tremendous influence with Andrew Carnegie and some of the other wealth creators in the Industrial Revolution. I'm trying to think of the bank. There was a banker who did the same and said he was the one who made a difference. So we often talk about rags to riches, and he was definitely the first one that fits into that category, because he did start out dirt poor pretty much and became so successful that he was able to retire at age 42. And at the end of his life, he said, "The years go by, and I hope I will be known as one who was useful and not just who died rich."
Jim Powell, excellent scholar and historian, has talked about Franklin's most glorious invention is actually the American dream. That his greatest invention is not the bifocal lens or harnessing the power of lightning. It's in fact creating this idea or this pattern of the American dream. How exactly did Franklin shape this idea, and how has he been kind of crucial to the ongoing shaping of it today?
So there's two elements of that, and one is the Horatio Alger kind of story, which, by the way, these little stories of people who started from rags to riches is told in the 19th century, while Franklin was in the 18th century. So he really was the original self-help, self-made man. And the other one is in his incredible optimism, and that's really relevant in this debate, because if you are optimistic, you're likely to take advantage of your challenges, your problems, your setbacks, and realize that you can move on and be successful. And he said this frequently, that he was like one time there was a really tough winter in France, and he wrote a friend and he said, but just lately there's little hints that the weather is calming and the flowers are coming out, and I'm happy. I'm a happy man. And it's that kind of optimism that you really, really want to see, because he had a lot of setbacks. I mean, he was fired one time as the colonial agent right before the Revolutionary War, and he was losing 1,800 pounds a year, which was a considerable sum back then. So he was unemployed, and he was able to survive because he had saved and scrimped and kept his lived within his means and was well diversified in his portfolio, so he's able to survive and prosper.
In some ways, Franklin almost seems like to be, besides maybe with the exception of someone such as Thomas Paine, the most optimistic of the founders, the one who sees the world as going to be a far, far better place in the future. And he's probably one of the founders who made the best predictions about how the future would look. As you kind of rightfully point out, if you brought most of the founders to today, they would be bewildered and they would be very terrified of all the different changes. Franklin would probably be a little more comfortable than the rest of them. But I want to kind of focus on why he's a little bit unique and a little bit different. And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head when you talk about how he had to scrimp, how he had to save, how he had to make his own money. Franklin began life quite poor, but ended life as quite an esteemed man and also quite wealthy as well, also using his wealth to help people and shape the city of Philadelphia. Do you think that's what contributed towards his unique optimism or his difference of opinion from other founders, was the fact that he had come from a poorer background and had seen the improvements in his own life, and so he had more faith in the average person?
I think one of the keys is he wanted to have a skill that other people could use. And so, like when he was, I think 19 or 20, he went to London, and he had already developed this skill as a premier printer. And when he went over to London, he got involved with some printers over there and improved his skills in that regard. And it's so important to have a skill in life. He was very big on education, self-education, and moving into an area that couldn't help but blossom over time. And that was, of course, the printing and the publishing business. And you mentioned Thomas Paine and common sense. Franklin actually financed and helped support him in that anonymous pamphlet. A lot of people thought Franklin wrote it. And, Thomas Paine says, we are starting the world over again. He was very optimistic about the Declaration of Independence and America's moving toward their own country and becoming a great country again. He definitely had that optimism. And in fact, I have a chapter 27 of The Greatest American. It's an academic article, and it's called Benjamin Franklin, Adam Smith's Invisible Hand. And what I mean by that is Adam Smith was the father of free market economics, and he wrote the book, The Wealth of Nations in 1776, and there's a whole section on America, and it's all upbeat. It says America will be one of the greatest nations in the world, most formidable nations in the world. This is Adam Smith. Well, he's getting an influence from Benjamin Franklin on that. And he actually, Adam Smith came out for America needs to be independent, which was quite controversial right at the beginning of the War of Independence. So Franklin definitely had those elements that suggest real success in the future.
Normally when we talk about the founders, again, it's all about politics, constitutional design and principles. They don't have as much to say about economics, but of all the founders, arguably Franklin had the most to say about economic sciences. And he has this wonderful line that I wish could be tattooed on the forehead of every politician: no nation was ever ruined by trade. Can you explain a bit why Franklin could say that no nation was ever ruined by trade at a time when mercantilism was very popular and the idea of regulating trade was considered to be one of the most important things a state could do?
Well, I just mentioned how Benjamin Franklin influenced Adam Smith, but it worked the other way as well. Adam Smith was a strong advocate. In fact, his biggest contribution in that book is on free trade and the case against mercantilism. He has chapter after chapter criticizing the crony capitalism and that sort of thing. Franklin was definitely influenced by that, and he says he's a free trader. No nation will ever ruined by trade, including those who are most disadvantaged. And of course, according to Trump, we're most disadvantaged, even though you look at the 5 biggest companies in the world right now in terms of market cap, and they're all American companies: Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, Apple. Those are all U.S.-based companies, right? So how can we be ripped off when we're the biggest companies in the world? So I have some problems with that, and so would Benjamin Franklin. That's the usefulness of my book, is Franklin is so applicable to today's hot issues in that respect. So yes, I think there is some elements to that.
Not that we can say exactly what Franklin would think about every minute issue of today, but if Franklin was brought into the 21st century, into American discourse at this time, would he largely have the same opinions that no nation was ever ruined by trade and that the American government are making massive mistakes that'll have repercussions decades down the line? Or do you think that he would say, well, the new modern world is very complex, maybe there's a role for the state to play?
He does once mention the idea of fair trade. He says, if you feel mistreated, it is going to affect your relationship with other countries. He was a diplomat after all. And but the ultimate goal is lower trade barriers. There's no question about it. He's a globalizing supporter of globalization in a very big way. And at one point he actually said, I am hopeful that our Constitution will be so ingrained in all countries. And he sent copies of the Constitution to other countries, Germany and Italy and so forth, and even France, and said, this is what you should imitate, so that everyone will recognize the rights of man and the rule of law, so that I can go in any country and stand there and say, this is my country. So I think he would, there's nothing wrong with negotiations and reciprocity and all of this sort of thing that is going on right now, but the end result needs to be lower tariffs, lower trade barriers on both sides. And there's no question that the U.S. there's a lot of goods and services the U.S. has a hard time getting into, so I can understand that desire. You do want fair trade, but you want free trade also.
You mentioned one of the big scary words of politics today, globalization. And now normally globalization is thought to be something a uniquely 20th and 21st century phenomenon, but Franklin was quite a global figure. Today, we kind of look back with hindsight 2020 saying he was amazing, fantastic, but people at the time recognized him as well, and he had quite an international reputation, especially in places like France. Why was he such a large character abroad? How did he become kind of the avatar of all things American? How did he become a global figure that represented America on such a massive scale, such a new nation?
Well, he really liked big cities. And there were no big cities in the United States at that time. Philadelphia was just a small town, maybe 50,000 people or something.
Was that the biggest?
Like that. Well, yeah, at the time, Philadelphia was the biggest. And then New York, obviously. And New York now is a major city as well as other cities. But he liked the big cities. He liked commercial life. He didn't think money-making was a sin. He's very modern in that respect. He's favored the sexual revolution in many ways. He loved the French people. He loved Britain as well. He loved London. And he was very much involved in the clubs and the salons in France, the clubs in London and the salons in France. And he was very good friends, and he played chess, and he engaged in the public discourse and the intellectual atmosphere. He loved Scotland, by the way. He's more Scotland than Ireland, sorry to say, but at one point he said, if I could retire anywhere, it would be in Scotland.
well, close enough to Ireland.
Yeah, that's not too bad.
Well, I have to ask, because you brought up Ireland, I read online that there was a letter about free trade and Ireland. Apparently it was an address that's supposedly given by Benjamin Franklin. Now, he denies he ever gave this address, but have you heard about this topic?
No, I haven't.
There's this very odd idea that he gave a speech on freedom of trade in Ireland, but he never really owned up to it fully, but it ends with the initials Benjamin Franklin. So, but
sometimes he would use a nom de plume, though.
Yes,
a lot of times.
Silence do good.
He had dozens of different names and stuff.
Well, I wanted to touch, you said something that I thought I would never hear, that Benjamin Franklin was in favor of the sexual revolution. Yeah. I don't think you often hear the phrase founding fathers and sexual revolution in the same sentence. We normally think of the founding fathers as a very puritanical, straight-laced bunch who did not talk about those kinds of topics at all. But Franklin was kind of known as a ladies' man. He was known not just for being a ladies' man, but also being friends with ladies, having quality conversations
married
with them.
And unmarried.
Married and unmarried.
Yeah.
Why did Franklin have such a different view? Because the majority of his contemporaries didn't have much time for the idea of women's rights or women's equality. It was a very secondary concern. Why did Franklin have such a different opinion to his contemporaries?
So I have some pictures in the middle of my book, and one of them is a picture of Norman Rockwell's painting of Franklin reading from Poor Richard's Almanac, surrounded by 4 or 5 French ladies. And so one thing you have to remember about Franklin is that he is in many ways the most modern of the founders. And he had an extremely positive view about women, and not just as sexual objects, but ones that you would enjoy a really good discussion with, or they would play chess together. There's lots of paintings of him playing chess. So he was very much involved with that sort of thing, and he was troubled. I tell you, he's a man of flesh and blood. He's a red-blooded American. He's not made of marble like some of the other founding fathers. Mm-hmm. And you have to remember that if you would wanted to sit down and talk to a founding father who would kind of give you the straight story and be frankly speaking, that would be Benjamin Franklin. Because if you sat down with George Washington and you asked him, well, why didn't you ever have children? Well, that would be an inappropriate question. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. If you asked Thomas Jefferson, what's your relationship with Sally Hemings? You would get a frown, and that would be inappropriate question to the Virginia aristocrats. Mm-hmm. So Franklin was pretty frank, and he admits in his autobiography that about the hard-to-govern passions and his errata in his life, which was an illegitimate child named William, who he raised with his wife Deborah, who was a common law marriage because Deborah was also married to another man who fled to the Caribbean but didn't know if he was dead or alive, so they had to have a common law marriage. But he corrected all that errata and settled down and was very faithful to his wife, Deborah. He probably strayed a little bit when he spent 8 years in London, because there is a picture of him kissing a young woman that was drawn by an artist. I have that in the book as well.
I have to ask, though, he was very big in international travel. I was going to say flew, but they didn't exist back then, planes. He sailed everywhere.
Yeah, but 8 times back and forth.
But his wife, Deborah, was terrified of sailing.
That's correct.
And so he left her back in America for years on end.
Yes, and he's been criticized. I have a chapter in my book, Franklin and His Critics, and one of the criticisms, there's a number of criticisms. It's a pretty heavy chapter. He was criticized for abandoning his wife, but really she abandoned him because she was the one who had this a severe animosity. She just feared getting on the open seas, and it was dangerous at the time. Franklin survived it. And at one point, William Strand, who was the publisher of The Wealth of Nations and The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, he's a very big publisher, and he was a friend with Franklin because they were both printers. And he wrote a letter to Deborah saying, you better get over here because the women really love Franklin and you better, this could be a problem. And she absolutely refused. And they were also intellectually different. She was more pedestrian, more interested in household issues and gossip and stuff like that. Franklin was a public intellectual who would spend time with kings and queens and with aristocrats and public intellectuals, and his wife wasn't that way at all. So they did become estranged to some extent. But when he died, he was buried right next to her in Philadelphia.
So I have to ask, when we look back at him, he's eccentric as it gets. He's an inventor. He's a scientist. He does a million different careers. He's a diplomat. He's kind of a character. He's wonderful to have conversation with. He always makes lots of hilarious jokes, lots of funny turns of phrases. Was he thought of
Scottish tunes?
Exactly. Was he thought of to be like an eccentric? When in Ireland and England, when we call someone an eccentric, it normally means they're just a little bit loopy. Do people ever wonder, is Franklin a little bit loopy, or were people always in awe of his intellect?
No, there's never really any criticism of Franklin for being loopy or being a little irrational and that sort of thing. He was just very talented and got along with everybody. He was actually quite known to be silent at times. He would not say hardly anything in the Continental Congress that he was a part of.
Very little recorded, yeah.
He did make one change in the Declaration of Independence to see how well you know the Declaration of Independence. Are you going to bring this up?
He changed it from these truths are holy and sacred to they're self-evident. Am I right?
So, Thomas Jefferson said sacred and undeniable. We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. Franklin, his left hand, scratched out the word sacred and undeniable and put in self-interest because of his rational science background.
I was going to say,
and he was a skeptic about religion and so forth. He was a deist, and he didn't want a religious term being used to our rights, and so he changed it to self-evident. So there is a definite philosophical issue there.
Just for people, deist used to be a very popular thing, not so much anymore. What is a deist, and why does that make Franklin a little bit different for his time? Or is it different for his time?
Well, for most of his life, he was a deist and a non-churchgoer. His critics called him a heretic and an unbeliever and so forth. That was not true. He believed in God and so forth. But he, the deist is the one who God winds up the creates the watch and winds it up and just lets it run without interference.
Yeah.
Franklin actually changed his mind on that, as he did on many issues. He changed his mind about inflation. He changed his mind about racism, about blacks. He changed his mind about religion as well, because he went from a deist to being a believing theist. That in the sense that at the Constitutional Convention, he gave a talk about why we need prayer. And he said, have we not witnessed in this revolution miracles so that we would win this war, that God would be on our side? The longer I live, the more I know that God governs in the affairs of men. Well, that's a active God who's betting on the side of the Americans. So Franklin changed his mind on religion, although he was never really a churchgoer. He actually donated money to all the religions, though, the synagogues, the Christian groups and so forth. He was friends with the Methodist preachers and everybody.
He's good. He's invested in every heaven, so it all works out. How would Franklin? I want to ask a little bit to wrap up the last few questions. How would Franklin navigate today's world? Back in his day, writers used to write all sorts of awful things about each other, all sorts of invective, venomous things they would say to each other. It's quite similar to today's online culture wars. And so I'm wondering if Franklin was placed into, had a fresh X account or was put on Blue Sky, would he just be like the rest of us, or would he have some sort of different take on how the culture war unfolds a little bit?
Well, back then you had to be careful what you said because there wasn't really that much free speech. So that's why he used these nom de plumes, anonymous names and stuff like that when he would write about something controversial. Today, people don't hide that much. They wear their emotions on their sleeves and they say what they want to say. I think he would be all in favor of that kind of thing. But he actually spoke out against speaking ill of your enemies in public. And he really wanted to convince people of his point of view. And you don't convince people by name-calling and insulting them. And I think that's a major difference between Ben Franklin and Donald Trump today in that regard. He would be more sympathetic with Ronald Reagan, who was much more diplomatic in his skills and so forth. But I don't think he would like the rancor that's going on today. He would want a more civilized. He believed in debate, vigorous debate. But he believed in civility in our culture, and I think we've lost a little bit of that.
What is something about the modern world that would surprise Franklin, and what's something that probably wouldn't surprise him very much, something that he expected to happen?
Well, what he expected was tremendous advances in technology and our standard of living. So if he actually at one point said, I was born too early, I should have been born 2 or 3 centuries later, which would be now, to enjoy this standard of living and flying on jets and using cell phones and telephones and HD TVs and streaming. And he would be the first to have a cell phone. He'd be texting. He'd be using AI, all of that sort of thing. He would love that. But at the same time, he would be appalled by the size and scope of government, the welfare state, the huge national debt, which he felt should be reduced, and live within your means and that sort of thing. But still, he would probably feel there's quite a bit of a freedom that we have today, socially, certainly culturally, that we didn't have in the past. David Bose would always make this point at the Cato Institute. He was always optimistic and felt that we had greater personal freedom and economic freedom today than we did 200 or 300 years ago. And I think that's very much Franklin in his views. But he once made a statement which I thought was very profound. He said, "No revenue is sufficient without economy." So you can bring in all the money you want in the treasury, but if you don't control your expenditures, and I was just meeting with Senator Rand Paul, and he was talking about how this new big, beautiful bill had huge spending, lots of spending, and that's how Trump had to get it through barely in a vote, because he had to promise a lot of pork and a lot of earmarks to all of these Republicans in order to get up to 50 votes.
And so just to finish us off, as the 250th anniversary of America's independence gets closer and closer, I think I've had a lot of these conversations with people where I talk about how much I love reading about the American founding, how I find the history of this nation, even though I'm not from it, I find it so fascinating, so interesting, and it makes me so passionate. It makes me really get engaged with ideas in a different way. But I find it hard to convince people, hey, take time out of your, very busy, modern texting life and go back and read a book from 250 years ago. That's a really hard thing to do with people. So you can do it on my behalf. What is your best pitch for people to go back and rediscover the writings of the founding era, even if they're the kind of person who doesn't read the most books or maybe isn't the most confident historian?
So I'll use Ben Franklin as an example, because he's probably the best example. If you want to start with the founding father, and read about a man who used to own slaves, not very many, servants basically, and then became an abolitionist. And he started off by supporting inflation, and then at the end he said, inflation is really not that good for the country. And so you have a man who is willing to change his mind. So I've been arguing that this should be a coffee table book. Yeah. That shouldn't be just on your shelf and you've read it, now you put it on your shelf or your nightstand. This should be a coffee table book. So what I'm saying is, you put this in front of the coffee table as your friends come around and they pick up the book and they say, oh my gosh, why is he the greatest American? And the answer is, everybody... I've talked to Republicans and Democrats and Americans of all, rich and poor and so on, and they all admire Benjamin Franklin because he unified us as a country, and he had that optimism, that belief in the American dream. I mean, who could be against the poor becoming better off? And then he had cultural interests and so forth, not just making money, but engaged in civic affairs and playing games and chess and stuff like that and singing songs. So he enjoyed life. It wasn't all business. So there's lots to feel like this is our man that we can all gather around and support and say, yeah, he's the greatest American and here's all the reasons why. And we need to be more like that. So that's my pitch.
And I have to ask, do you ever think there'll be an American like Benjamin Franklin again?
It's very difficult because we're so divisive, but surely there's someone who reads this book and says, well, okay, industry, thrift, and prudence, those are all positive terms that every American would support. They're not extreme. They're Aristotelian golden mean. Civil dialogue, if we could do that, because he loved debates. But again, you need to kind of persuade people, not force people to do the right thing. So with that in mind, plus there's this certain element of ambition. And many Americans are ambitious. And Franklin once said, it's incredible the quantity of good that a single man or woman can do if they make a business out of it. And we need a culture. I'll tell you the other thing that's really important is we need to be careful that we don't flaunt our wealth, okay? And I think that's a problem in today's society. This inequality issue does bug people. And we need to, I'm more of a Warren Buffett fan. And Warren Buffett loves Ben Franklin, by the way. And Warren Buffett said, I got my 3-bedroom house that I've lived in 50 years. The only reason I have a jet is because they require it, my corporation. But he's down to earth. And Franklin was down to earth. Franklin was the kind of person who could sit down with you, whether you were a plumber or the king of England or an intellectual or a scientist or a businessman. He could talk to everybody. So he was a man of all seasons, if you will. And I don't know if there's somebody out there, but Elon Musk for a while was like that. A businessman, very successful, but he got into politics, and unfortunately,
ruined him.
It ruined, and he's going back to business, hopefully, and staying with it. It is unfortunate. It's difficult. It's a difficult mission, and Franklin somehow was able to do it. And so maybe he's the greatest American forever. Who knows?
That was a fantastic ending. I think that was wonderful. Thank you so much, Mark, for everything. That was fantastic.
My pleasure.